Reading today from Psalm 62 from the English Standard Version. For God alone my soul waits in silence. From him comes my salvation. He alone is my rock and my salvation, my fortress. I shall not be greatly shaken. How long will all of you attack a man to batter him like a leaning wall, a tottering fence? They only plan to thrust him down from his high position. They take pleasure in falsehood. They bless with their mouths, but inwardly they curse. For God alone, O my soul, wait in silence. For my hope is from him. He only is my rock and my salvation, my fortress. I shall not be shaken. On God rests my salvation and my glory. My mighty rock, my refuge is God. Trust in him at all times, O people. Pour out your heart before him, for God is a refuge for us. Those of low estate are but a breath. Those of high estate are a delusion. In the balance as they go up, they are together lighter than a breath. Put no trust in extortion. Set no vain hopes on robbery. If riches increase, set not your heart on them. For once God has spoken, twice have I heard this, that power belongs to God, and that you, O Lord, belong steadfast love, for you will render to a man according to his work. This is the word of the Lord. Hey, let's welcome Ali as she comes and shares God's word. Let's give her an applause today.
Thank you, Pastor Will. For God alone, my soul waits in silence. I think it's safe to say that waiting is one of the most universally disliked things that we have to do in our life. I think maybe close behind is probably silence. But waiting is something that we all experience, whether it's waiting in line, waiting for our packages to arrive, waiting for the results of a test or an outcome of surgery, waiting for where you want to be in your life, waiting for a hard season to pass. We all experience waiting. And if you think about it through the Christian lens, our whole experience of life really is just waiting. We live in a time that's sometimes called the now and not yet, where Jesus has come to earth. The kingdom of God has been brought to earth. It is here now. And yet there's still sin here, and we're still waiting for the return of Christ and the culmination of his kingdom. So much of what we do is just waiting. In the 1960s, there was an experiment conducted at Stanford University. It was called the marshmallow experiment. You might have heard about it over the last couple of years. I know it's been a trend online where you put a marshmallow in front of a child and you say, wait 15 minutes. If you don't eat this marshmallow, you can have a second marshmallow. And so you can imagine this is quite difficult for kids. It's quite a challenge. But the results of how long the kids were able to wait actually varied quite a bit. And it teaches us a little bit about our experience while we wait, our behavior while we wait. And so some of the kids developed little coping strategies. They sang to distract themselves, or they covered their eyes, they looked away from the marshmallow, pretended it didn't exist. And others just simply took matters into their own hands and ate the marshmallow. But the long-term results of this experiment show that the kids who were able to wait 15 minutes for a second marshmallow tended to achieve higher academic success and better emotional regulation later in life. And then later in 2018, the experiment was replicated, and this time it was controlled for family background and home stability. And so a new finding came up from this 2018 experiment, that kids who were from reliable, stable environments were able to wait significantly longer because they had learned to trust adults. And so when the experimenter came and then left the room, they trusted that they would come back and bring the second marshmallow. They trusted in their environment. And so then a new conclusion was drawn that waiting went beyond a mere willpower, and that trust in your environment strengthened the child's ability to wait. isn't it true that our environment, the world around us, it doesn't strengthen our ability to wait? It doesn't strengthen our ability to hold steady in the face of uncertainty. There's an inherent instability in the world around us, and more often than not, we are faced with obstacles that make things seem out of our control. And so we're just left waiting for things to fall into place, waiting for our lives to look how we want it to look, waiting for trials to end. And in fact, waiting can signal to our brains that something isn't going according to plan. But as we go through Psalm 62 today, I want to show you how David invites us into a different experience of waiting. In this series that we're in, Praying the Psalms, we're being invited into a practice of not just reading the Psalms, but of using them as our personal prayers. And the Psalms expand our prayer language. They give us structure and frameworks that help to guide our conversations with God. But I think most importantly, the Psalms take us out of our own worldly way of thinking, and they bring us into a way of living and being and communicating with God that can transform our hearts and our minds. And our world is filled with conflict and chaos, and out of that comes fear and panic and overwhelm, and yet Psalm 62 offers an alternative posture in the face of trials. And we see David enter into an experience of waiting that is non-anxious. It's relaxed. It's trusting. In the life of David, the writer of our psalm today, it was characterized almost entirely by waiting through trials for God's plans and promises. When David was somewhere around 15, he was anointed as the future king of Israel. And yet it wasn't until he was 30 that he was actually crowned king, and only over Judah. And it wasn't until he was 37, over 20 years after being anointed, that he was finally crowned king over all of Israel. So imagine being told that something is going to happen, and then 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years. If that was me, I would start to think, what am I supposed to be doing? How can I control this situation? How can I get to where I need to be? I've been told this is going to happen. What am I doing wrong? And this time of waiting, it wasn't enjoyable for the most part. He spends years facing challenges and opposition from people around him, on the run from those trying to kill him, uncertain of when it would all end. And we see pretty quickly in Psalm 62 that he's right in the middle of opposition as he prays this psalm. Verses 3 and 4 say, "How long will all of you attack a man to batter him like a leaning wall, a tottering fence? They only plan to thrust him down from his high position." And if you really look at the grand scheme of David's life, I don't know that there's ever really a sense of arriving. Because even his reign faces trials. Obviously, some are of his own doing. But there's family betrayal, there's unfulfilled dreams, there's running for his life. He is always waiting for a promise to be fulfilled, for a dream to be realized, for a trial to end. And yet, woven into David's story is evidence of a deep, restful trust in God. David's declaration in Psalm 62 is that when faced with uncertainty, his soul can rest in confidence in God who has it all under control. And it's this restful trust that's the anchoring idea of this psalm. And we find it right in that first verse. "For God alone my soul waits in silence. From him comes my salvation." And your version may say, "Truly my soul finds rest in God." And the Hebrew word here that translates to waiting in silence or rest is dumia. And this word helps us to understand David's position or David's posture as he writes this prayer in the middle of his own trials. Dumia can translate into a few different words and ideas, primarily stillness, quietness, rest, or waiting. And this isn't an anxious fear of something unknown, a pacing back and forth. It is an intentional quieting of himself before God, an intentional posture. It's a waiting that is anchored in the salvation of God. And verses 1 and 2 together say, "For God alone my soul waits in silence. From him comes my salvation. He alone is my rock and my salvation, my fortress, I shall not be shaken." There's a story in the New Testament that came to mind as I was reflecting on David's posture in this psalm. Matthew 8, Jesus travels with his disciples and a storm rises up around them. And verses 23 to 26 say, "Then he got into the boat and his disciples followed him. Suddenly a furious storm came up on the lake so that the waves swept over the boat. But Jesus was sleeping. The disciples went and woke him up, saying, 'Lord, save us, we're going to drown.' And he replied, 'You of little faith, why are you so afraid?' And then he got up and rebuked the winds and the waves, and it was completely calm." There are two responses to the storm in this story. There's a restful waiting for the storm to pass, and there's a panicked reaction of what the storm might bring. And I would imagine for most of us, that panicked reaction feels a little bit more familiar, whether we're good at hiding it or not. And so how can we enter into that restful trust that we see in Jesus, that we see in Psalm 62? As we read this psalm, a roadmap is revealed that helps us to discover how David arrived at this place and how we in turn can arrive there too, this unanxious waiting. As we've seen already, David is facing opposition in this psalm. He says in verses 3 and 4, "How long will all of you attack a man to batter him? Like a leaning wall, a tottering fence. They only plan to thrust him down from his high position. They take pleasure in falsehood. They bless with their mouths, but inwardly they curse." It's very quickly after this opening picture of a still, confident rest in God, we have this contrasting image of instability. David's declaration that he will not be greatly shaken is suddenly threatened. He compares himself to a leaning wall, a tottering fence, wondering, how long will this end? Or how long will this last? But as we move through the psalm, we find echoes of David's posture of trust. Verses 5 and 6 say, "For God alone, O my soul, wait in silence, for my hope is from him. He only is my rock and my salvation, my fortress, I shall not be shaken." Instead, we find ourselves repeating back verses 1 and 2 here. Almost. Notice that there's a slight shift in the language there. And depending on your translation, mine says, "For God alone my soul waits in silence. From him comes my salvation." Where verse 5 says, "For God alone, O my soul, wait in silence, for my hope is from him." Do you hear the difference there? Where all of a sudden, in the presence of chaos and enemies around him, David is calling out to his own soul. He's reminding himself to wait in silence for God. For God alone, O my soul, wait in silence. It even shifts the language here from salvation to hope. Hope defined as an optimistic state of mind that helps people to look towards the future with trust and confidence. And I like to imagine that as David is surrounded by his enemies, everything is in shambles, things are falling apart, he feels like falling apart, and he musters up all the strength that he has left, and he looks himself in the mirror and he says, "Hey, it's all gonna be okay. Your hope is in the God who saves." Have you ever done this, given yourself a pep talk in the mirror like that? That's what I imagine David doing here. "Oh, my soul, wait in silence." In the midst of conflict, he is reminding himself of what he already knows to be true, even if he can't quite feel it. And so the trust that was built in times of peace, it's now being rehearsed in times of stress. And the Psalms as a whole are filled with repetitive language. And there's a good chance that if you've read the Psalms, these words that David uses throughout this one are familiar to you. He describes God as his rock, his fortress, his salvation, his hope. These are poetic writings, and in poetry, repetition is used as a literary device to help emphasize key themes and ideas. And so many times within the Psalms themselves, we will find repeated words or phrases that help us to understand the posture and the heart of the psalmist. And our brains are hardwired to learn and build muscle memory through repetition. And so once you've repeated something enough, a movement or a thought process or a posture, it starts to feel more natural to you, whether good or bad. And so here, we see David react to the external chaos around him with a return to the practiced, repeated posture that we saw in verses 1 and 2. And it's not a mindless repetition of empty words, but reminding himself over and over again of the truths that he knows about God, about why God is trustworthy. My salvation is from you. My hope is from you. You are my rock. You are my fortress. And so as he waits for trials to pass, David is intentionally counseling his soul back to the truths of God that he knows are bigger than himself. For God alone, O my soul, wait in silence. As we talk about slowing down and trusting in God through uncertainty, there's a risk that we mistake waiting in silence or finding rest in God with avoidance or distraction from the challenges that we face. And going back to the marshmallow experiment, some of the kids coped with the challenge of waiting for the second marshmallow by avoiding the marshmallow altogether. They closed their eyes or averted their eyes from what was in front of them. And by doing that, the experience of waiting could be made just a little bit less painful, like they were trying to forget what they were actually waiting for. But that's not what we see in this psalm. Avoidance of our realities, it doesn't bring us into this posture of still waiting that we find in Psalm 62. David is deeply rooted in the reality of his situation. He says, "Trust in him at all times, O people. Pour out your heart before him. God is a refuge for us." Pour out your heart before him. Can you imagine if David, who spent years being hunted down by people trying to kill him, years facing opposition, years facing challenges, if he never brought his very real pain and uncertainty before God? David wrote some beautiful, heartbreaking psalms of lament through his life, pouring out his raw emotion before God. This might not be relatable to everyone, but you know the feeling you have after a really good cry? Like a weight has been lifted off of you. And the sleep that you have after a really good cry, if you haven't had that, I would recommend it. It's a really great way to have a really good sleep, and it's clearly biblical, so. But this is what the release of emotion does for you. It brings us into this full body release, this rest. And next week, Pastor Oliver will dive a little bit deeper into prayer through lament, or prayer of lament through Psalm 13. But I love that in this psalm about trusting in God, we're not hit with a blanket, it's all going to be okay because God said so. Because it's in fact not the reality of the world that we live in. We are still waiting for the culmination of the kingdom. We know that we will face trials. And here on earth, things will not always feel okay. And David knew this, and he felt this. And so he brought it all before God, poured out his heart, emptied himself before God. We can't get to a place of still, quiet trust in God, a restful waiting, if we're not first honest about our own situations. If we don't first admit that there is, in fact, something out of our control. And so as we move through the roadmap of Psalm 62, we start with intentionally slowing ourselves down and turning ourselves towards the truths of God. For God alone, O my soul, wait in silence. And then we reflect within, bringing to a trustworthy God everything that we're facing. Pour out your heart towards him. God is a refuge for us. As we move into the closing few verses of this psalm, David speaks not just of what we can trust, where we can place our trust, but where we can't. I remember having to learning how to write a persuasive essay in school. And a really good persuasive essay lays out all the reasons why you should choose something, and then it gives you all of the alternatives and tells you why you shouldn't choose those things. And if David was writing a persuasive essay in Psalm 62, he would have passed my grade 6 English class. And see, he doesn't just root his trust in God's character, in his steadfastness, in his promise of salvation, but he weighs out the alternatives for us. Because what is our instinctual response when things aren't going according to plan? Avoidance is one for sure, one that I know well. Or you might take action. You might look for another solution. You might make a new plan, find a new way around, find a new place to put your trust. David acknowledges that this is what we're going to be drawn to. As we look around, there's a temptation to see in others what God might not be giving to you. Verse 9 says, those of low estate are but a breath. Those of high estate are a delusion. In the balances, they go up. They are together lighter than a breath. And so where God is a mighty rock, a refuge, a fortress, humans are a delusion, lighter than breath. Literally, they have no weight or substance. And so when David says, in the balances they go up, he's creating a picture of a scale here where we have people on one side, lighter than breath, and we have God on the other, a mighty rock. And the psalm goes on to say, put no trust in extortion, set no vain hopes in robbery. If riches increase, set not your heart on them. Jesus says, don't trust in wealth. That's not where your hope is. And though it might feel like it brings comfort and stability, ultimately, these are not the things that bring your salvation. In God alone, my soul waits in silence. He alone is my rock and my salvation. So there are going to be things that, when we look around, they look like really strong alternatives in the face of uncertainty. Maybe it's looking towards financial security, control, or planning, trusting in our relationships or our institutions. And David specifically names them. He calls them out. Don't put your trust in riches. Don't put your trust in people. And it's not that we don't plan or act wisely, but that ultimately this deep soul rest, this waiting that feels peaceful, it's found when our trust is in God. And by intentionally naming our alternatives, by assessing his surroundings, he is reaffirming the place where he can be most confident. And so we slow down and we turn to God. And we reflect within, and we turn away from our alternatives. For God alone, O my soul, wait in silence. Pour out your heart towards God. He is a refuge for us. Put no trust in extortion. David closes with this final declaration. Once God has spoken, twice I have heard this, that power belongs to God, and that to you, O Lord, belongs steadfast love, for you will render a man according to his work. With God is absolute power. Nothing can stand against him. And so David's closing argument, that in the face of our waiting, in the face of our trials and uncertainty, our God is both just and merciful. He is both powerful and loving. and that ultimately everything is in his hands. That is why we trust him. For God alone, my soul waits in silence. Praying the psalm invites us to become reflective people who slow down and wait. People who choose to trust God even as the world pulls us away. And early Christian writers like Athanasius commended Psalm 62 for morning prayer, where that anchoring idea, dumia, instructs believers to start the day with a composed trust rather than a hurried speech. And this psalm invites us to wait. It invites us to choose trust. And it reframes waiting not as something being out of control, but as a time sitting in the presence of God, waiting unhurried at his feet. But this is an active waiting. It's not that we're doing nothing. We are actively looking to God for our stability. And we start with the truths of God, just like this psalm. And maybe today God's character feels certain and stable. Maybe as we worship today, you felt confident in the God that you were singing about. But maybe today, those words felt a little harder. Maybe today, God doesn't feel present in your life. He doesn't feel close. But the invitation here is an intentional posture, whether you feel it or not. This is a choice to remind yourself of who God is. For God alone, oh my soul, you can slow down and wait. My hope is in you, God. My trust is in you, God. My salvation is from you, God. What are the truths of God that you need to remind yourself of today? Keeping our eyes on the truths of God, we openly pour our hearts out to him. We look within, reflecting on our hopes and dreams, our struggles, our sin, our heartbreak. God doesn't want us to pull ourselves together and perform for him. He wants us to empty ourselves out into his arms so that he can provide the steady ground. What are the things that you're waiting for? Where are you longing for things to be different? As we pour out our hearts, honest with the realities that we're facing, we look outward at those places that we might be tempted to trust, where we may become distracted from the only place that we can truly rest in confidence. Look around at your life. Name them. Call them out. Where is it that you're turning to in the face of uncertainty? Are there places in your life where you're making plans when God has called you to wait? With this posture mapped out for us in this psalm, we can start to shift our anxious souls to ones that rest in God. From panicking through the storm to sleeping soundly. Becoming people who intentionally cultivate a stable environment so that we can wait with anticipation to see how God shows up when we give him the space. As you pray through Psalm 62 this week, I want to invite you to engage in this reflective posture, reminding yourselves of the truths of God's character, whether you believe it or not. Being honest with your own struggles and feelings, and naming those things that are pulling your trust from God. I'm going to end with a quote from Margaret Gunther, who was a priest and a theology professor. The prayer of silence is a prayer of listening, waiting, and receptivity. It calls for gentle attentiveness. Those concerned with productivity might see it as the kind of prayer in which nothing happens, but it really is the prayer of being rather than doing, in which everything happens. For God alone, our soul in silence waits.